The kings and queens history forgot. Lives full of crowns, curses, and quiet catastrophes. Sleepy, strange, and strangely fascinating. Meet the monarchs who ruled, suffered, and vanished into history's shadows. Part 1. Forgotten Kings. Remarkable but boring stories revealed. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we're dimming the lights, grabbing a blanket, and drifting into the royal archives to meet some of history's most unremarkably remarkable kings. The kind of monarchs who technically ruled nations, but probably couldn't rule their own breakfast schedule. These are the forgotten ones. Not because they didn't exist, but because they were just a bit too mid. The ones who reigned, yawned, and quietly shuffled off into history's lukewarm corner. So get cozy. Let's glide back a few centuries to the era when being born into power mostly meant dying of gout before your 30s. King Henry VI of England, the sleepiest monarch in history. Let's start with Henry VI, because if we're talking about forgotten kings, this man was practically designed by fate to be the human embodiment of a soft sigh. Born in 1421, he technically became king before he could even walk, which sounds impressive until you realize he also spent most of his adult life not really walking through reality either. Henry inherited two kingdoms, England and France, during one of the least relaxing times in medieval history. The 100 Years' War was still dragging on like a bad family argument nobody could remember the start of. Henry V was the ultimate warrior king, all charisma, victories, and chest-thumping medieval glory. Henry VI was not that. While Dad was out conquering France, Henry VI was more into books, quiet prayer, and having mild breakdowns whenever someone raised their voice. You could say he was deeply pious, or you could say he was one nervous breakdown away from joining a monastery. Both would be correct. By the time Henry actually started ruling, the kingdom was basically in a slow-motion collapse. His advisors fought, his nobles rebelled, and his mind, well, took extended vacations. At one point, he literally fell into a catatonic state for over a year. People would talk to him, and he'd just stare into the middle distance like a medieval Windows loading screen. When his wife, Margaret of Anjou, gave birth to their son, Henry didn't respond, didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't even blink much. Just blank. The medieval version of blue screen of death. And then one day, poof, he woke up like nothing happened. Oh, we have a son now. Lovely. Henry's entire life was like that. Bursts of strange awareness, followed by long, quiet stretches of mental fog. During his reign, England lost almost all its French territory. Nobles turned against him, and eventually, the Wars of the Roses began. Basically, a long family feud where everyone wore flowers to make murder look festive. Henry, bless him, kept trying to be peaceful. But in 15th century England, peaceful was just another word for replaceable. Eventually, he was overthrown, imprisoned, restored briefly, and then overthrown again. Finally, someone likely decided that England had had enough of his gentle confusion, and he died in the Tower of London. The records say he was found dead, which in royal code usually means somebody found a pillow convenient. Henry VI's reign was tragic, yes, but also strangely soothing. He's a reminder that sometimes the crown lands on the wrong head, and that being too nice can be politically fatal. Let's float on to another royal who could have used a therapist, or at least a hobby. Charles II of Spain, the unlucky Habsburg potato. Now, we can't talk about forgotten kings without mentioning the Habsburg family.
That royal dynasty was like Europe's longest-running genetics experiment, and the results were not great. Enter Charles II of Spain, born 1661, and possibly the most medically unfortunate king in all of European history. His ancestors had been marrying their cousins for centuries because, nothing says political stability like sharing 90% of your DNA with your spouse. By the time Charles arrived, the Habsburg family tree wasn't really a tree anymore, more like a circle, a slightly damp, confused circle. Charles himself was the grand finale of that centuries-long genetics loop. His face was a living family crest, long jaw, drooping mouth, and the kind of underbite that could open letters. Contemporary accounts said he couldn't chew properly, struggled to walk, and didn't speak until he was 4. His mother, Mariana of Austria, doted on him constantly, probably because she knew her son's survival was more miracle than monarchy. He was officially known as El Hechizado, or the Embitched, because people genuinely thought he was cursed, which, to be fair, is understandable when your king looks like someone hexed a bread roll. Charles ruled Spain during a time when the empire was collapsing faster than his health. The economy was a mess, the colonies were restless, and he had no children because, well, his body said absolutely not. Royal doctors spent years performing bizarre rituals to cure him, making him drink human skull powder, exorcising demons, and even forcing him to touch holy relics to improve fertility. None of it worked. One doctor wrote that Charles's body did not contain a single healthy drop of blood, which sounds poetic, but was probably just a polite 17th century way of saying, this man is hanging by a thread. By the time Charles died at 38, Spain's royal bloodline was officially exhausted. He left behind no heirs, a crumbling empire, and a legend that managed to outlive his actual political achievements. The War of Spanish Succession followed, all because Charles's family didn't think maybe marrying outside the family once in a while might be healthy. So, if you've ever felt unproductive in life, just remember, Charles II was king of one of the largest empires on earth and still managed to accomplish absolutely nothing. Let's drift over to another monarch whose defining talent was mediocrity in motion. King John of England, the man who signed his own downfall. Now, most people remember King John as the bad guy from Robin Hood. And honestly, that's pretty accurate. But not in an exciting villain way, more in a how did this guy even get the job kind of way. He was born in 1166, the youngest son of King Henry III. Being the youngest in a royal family was basically a curse. No lands, no power, and a lot of awkward family dinners where everyone else had a kingdom already. His nickname early on was John Lackland, which, sounds more like a guy who just lost his luggage. When he finally became king, John inherited a full empire, England, parts of France, and all the drama his ancestors could leave behind. But in just a few years, he managed to lose most of it. He was paranoid, greedy, and famously petty, like he once starved a family of nobles to death for annoying him. He raised taxes constantly, insulted the church, and accidentally triggered a full-blown rebellion. Imagine being so bad at your job that your own barons force you to sign a document promising you'll behave, and then name it the Magna Carta. It's the medieval version of your coworkers making you sign an HR form that says, "Stop being the worst." He signed it, of course, but immediately tried to wriggle out of it, which went about as well as you'd expect. The barons rebelled again, the French invaded, and John died of dysentery while retreating through a swamp. Not exactly a heroic ending. But here's the thing. For all his incompetence, John accidentally gave England one of its most important historical documents. The Magna Carta would later inspire constitutions around the world. So, in a deeply ironic twist, the most useless king in English history also set the stage for modern democracy. John's reign was like a bad sitcom that somehow spun off into a timeless classic.
Part 2. The Mad, the Melancholy, and the mildly delusional kings. Hey again, night owls. Still awake? That's impressive, because tonight's batch of monarchs could probably lull an insomniac into a coma. We're floating deeper into the candlelit corners of royal history, past the heroes and conquerors, and into the ones who mostly stared at walls, made weird decisions, and occasionally mistook themselves for divine vegetables. These are the kings who ruled quietly, sometimes too quietly, and whose personal lives were so odd you almost want to tuck them in and tell them it's okay. Let's start with a man who tried to outwit the heavens and ended up arguing with the moon. King Charles VI of France, the king who forgot he was a king. If Henry VI was the sleepiest monarch in England, Charles VI of France was the most confused. Born in 1368, Charles took the throne young and started strong, charming, handsome, full of potential. His people called him Charles the Beloved, which is how you know things were about to go downhill. By his mid-20s, Charles began suffering from what we'd now call severe psychotic episodes. Medieval doctors, however, called it being cursed, because of course they did. One summer day in 1392, Charles set off on a military campaign. Everything was fine, until one of his soldiers accidentally dropped a spear, making a loud noise. Charles suddenly snapped, eyes glazed, sword drawn, and started attacking his own men. By the time they pulled him away, several were dead, and Charles was babbling incoherently. When he woke up later, he had no memory of it, which, frankly, was probably for the best. After that, Charles's mind unraveled like an old tapestry. He'd go through long stretches of calm, then spiral into delusion again. At one point, he refused to bathe or change clothes for months. He also insisted that his name wasn't Charles, and that he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He believed that if anyone touched him, he'd shatter. He even had special iron rods sewn into his clothes to protect his fragile frame. Imagine being the royal tailor on that assignment. So, just to confirm, Your Majesty wants armor against hugs? His poor wife, Queen Isabel of Bavaria, spent years trying to manage him, which mostly meant trying to stop the court from completely collapsing. While Charles wandered his palace muttering about invisible enemies, France slid into chaos. The 100 Years' War reignited, nobles fought for control, and the country basically ran itself into the ground. By the time Charles died in 1422, France was divided, demoralized, and ready for a century-long identity crisis. It's hard not to feel bad for him, though. In another world, one without constant war, inbreeding, and 14th century medicine, Charles might have just been the eccentric guy feeding pigeons in a park somewhere. Instead, he was the glass king who forgot who he was. Let's float over to a king whose hobby was less tragic and more architecturally concerning. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the king who built his own fairy tale.
Fast forward a few centuries to the 19th century and meet Ludwig II, the man who made delusion into an art form. Literally. Born in 1845, Ludwig became king of Bavaria at just 18. He was tall, brooding, and wildly romantic. He loved art, music, and solitude, which are unfortunately not the best traits for running a government. Instead of ruling, he decided he'd rather live in a dream world of his own design. So he did. He spent his entire reign building enormous castles, fantastical, glittering palaces inspired by fairy tales and opera sets. His most famous creation, Neuschwanstein Castle, looks like something that escaped from a Disney movie, except it came before Disney. He even modeled parts of it after the works of composer Rainer Wagner, who Ludwig was absolutely obsessed with. In fact, Ludwig was so devoted to Wagner that he basically became his personal sponsor. He paid off Wagner's debts, built theaters for him, and funded his operas, even when the government begged him to stop. The people loved the castles. The treasury did not. Bavaria's finances started sinking faster than Ludwig's grip on reality. He stopped attending meetings, refused to speak to ministers, and spent nights taking gondola rides by candlelight in an underground lake he had built beneath one of his palaces, because of course he did. Eventually, the state declared him insane and forced him to abdicate. Just days later, Ludwig was found dead in a shallow lake alongside his psychiatrist. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened. Some say he drowned, others suspect murder, but the most fitting theory, maybe he just followed his fairy tale instincts and decided to vanish into his own story. Today, Ludwig's castles are Germany's top tourist attractions, which means he technically succeeded, just posthumously. Let's glide from delusional dreamers to delusional believers. Philip V of Spain, the king who forgot to get out of bed. Now, if Charles II of Spain was cursed by genetics, Philip V, his distant relative, was cursed by depression and a deep hatred of mornings. Born in 1883, Philip became the first Bourbon king of Spain after the War of Spanish Succession. He was young, charming, and, according to his doctors, chronically miserable. From early in his reign, Philip suffered severe mood swings. He'd go from manic bursts of energy to days, sometimes weeks, of refusing to get out of bed. His courtiers learned to rule Spain around his blankets. Ministers would sit by his bedside, reading state papers aloud while Philip mumbled responses from under the covers. His wife, Queen Isabella Ferranze, basically became his caretaker/political manager. At one point, Philip got so depressed after his death that he refused to change clothes or eat for days. Eventually, he gave up the throne entirely, only to take it back a few years later because he got bored of retirement. He was, in short, the world's first reluctant workaholic king. But his reign wasn't all gloom. He reformed parts of Spain's government, encouraged the arts, and restored some stability after decades of chaos. Still, his personal life remained a haze of anxiety, religious obsession, and exhaustion. When he finally died in 1446, Spain mourned him deeply, but also probably breathed a small sigh of relief. Running a country around someone's sleep schedule can't have been easy. Let's drift a little north now, to a monarch whose hobbies included pretending to be a soldier and accidentally invading himself. Christian VII of Denmark, the boy who wouldn't grow up. Born in 1749, Christian became king at just 17, which already sounds like a recipe for disaster. Add in childhood neglect, untreated mental illness, and a kingdom full of scheming nobles, and you get Denmark's most awkward monarch. He was energetic, charming, and completely unfit to rule. He loved pranks, public performances, and making people uncomfortable at dinner. One ambassador wrote that Christian touched everyone he met inappropriately, male or female, and laughed hysterically about it. Basically, Denmark was ruled by a chaotic teenager with a crown. He also suffered from schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, though no one at the time had the words for it. His court physicians tried to cure him with cold baths, leeches, and at one point, excessive horse riding. Unsurprisingly, none of this worked. Things might have ended there, except for one man, Johan Struensee, the royal doctor who basically became Denmark's secret ruler. Struensee convinced Christian to sign a bunch of reform laws, abolishing torture, improving education, and modernizing the kingdom. So far, so good. Except Struensee also started an affair with the queen. And because royal gossip spreads faster than plague, the court found out. Struensee was executed, the queen was exiled, and Christian was quietly pushed into the background. For the rest of his life, he drifted in and out of lucidity, occasionally reenacting military.
Part 3. Lonely Crowns and Sad Kingdoms. Hey again, dream travelers. Still with me? Good. You're doing great. Tonight, we're slipping even deeper into the quietest corners of royal misery. The ones history forgot. Not because they failed spectacularly, but because they just faded away. This is the chapter of the lonely kings, the ones who had everything except peace of mind. The soft-hearted rulers who prayed too much, trusted the wrong people, and occasionally whispered secrets to empty rooms. Let's begin with a man who was both a saint and a tragedy in silk slippers. King Louis IX of France, the saint who forgot to smile. Now, being called Saint Louis might sound flattering, but when your entire life is one long pious to-do list, it's less divine and more exhausting. Born in 1214, Louis IX grew up in an era when holiness and monarchy didn't always mix. Most kings were busy waging wars, drinking wine, and having children with suspiciously identical mistresses. Louis, however, wanted to be good. Too good. He prayed constantly, fasted like a monk, and insisted his court live pure lives. He banned gambling, punished blasphemy, and personally washed the feet of beggars, which was nice if you ignored the fact that the beggars were also slightly terrified of him. Louis ruled France for 40 years, and admittedly ruled it well. But his obsession with spiritual perfection made him emotionally fragile. He carried guilt like a crown, always worried he wasn't holy enough or that God might be quietly judging his tax policies. When he wasn't praying, he was crusading. Literally, he led not one but 2 crusades to the Middle East, both of which went terribly. During the first, he was captured by Egyptian forces and had to be ransomed back to France. During the second, he died of dysentery while his army disintegrated in North Africa. He was canonized after his death, which is nice, but let's be honest. It's the medieval version of Employee of the Month. Louis IX's life was one long struggle to balance faith and duty. A man who wanted heaven but got earth instead. And in the end, maybe that's the saddest kind of king, the one who actually meant well. Let's drift east now, to a man who ruled an empire of ice, snow, and paranoia. Ivan VI of Russia,
the boy king who never saw daylight. Few kings in history have had a shorter or lonelier reign than Ivan VI. Born in 1740, crowned before he could walk, and overthrown before he could talk, he became Emperor of Russia at just 2 months old, which sure sounds impressive on paper until your entire reign ends before you even learn where a crown is. His great-aunt, Elizabeth Petrovna, decided she wanted the throne instead, because of course she did, and launched a coup. Ivan's family was arrested, and the baby emperor was quietly shipped off to a fortress. There, he would spend the rest of his life. No childhood, no friends, no sunlight, just silence and guards who weren't allowed to speak to him. As he grew older, he didn't even know who he was. He had no books, no letters, nothing. Occasionally, curious officers would try to talk to him, only to be punished for it. His captors were under strict orders. If anyone tried to free him, kill him immediately. And that's exactly what happened. In 1764, a group of soldiers attempted a rescue. The guards, following orders, stabbed the 23-year-old Ivan to death in his cell. His final words aren't recorded, probably because he didn't say any. Ivan VI's story is almost too quiet, the sound of a life erased by politics before it ever began. The ultimate forgotten king. Let's float somewhere warmer now, to Italy, land of sunshine, music, and one man who hated all of it. Ferdinand I of the two Sicilies, the king who hated governing. If laziness was a royal virtue, Ferdinand I would have been a saint. Born in 1751, he ruled Naples and Sicily, two gorgeous Mediterranean kingdoms full of art, food, and constant revolutions. Ferdinand, however, wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of that. He avoided politics like the plague. Ministers ran the country while Ferdinand hunted, fished, and napped. His idea of state business was deciding which dog to pet first. He was described by one ambassador as good-natured, but with the mind of a child and the appetite of a pig, which, while harsh, wasn't entirely inaccurate. He'd eat entire meals with his hands, chase servants for fun, and laugh at his own farts, while wearing a crown. When Napoleon invaded Italy, Ferdinand panicked, fled his capital, and hid in Sicily. From there, he ruled what was left of his realm through letters written in atrocious grammar. One letter simply said, "Things are bad, fix them." Eventually, he got his throne back, but did nothing with it. He spent the rest of his life in idle contentment, surrounded by dogs, pastries, and denial. Historians still debate whether Ferdinand was a fool or a genius. After all, he outlived nearly everyone who tried to overthrow him by doing absolutely nothing. Sometimes, apathy really is a strategy. Let's drift north again, to Britain, where one king proved that having emotions in public was a revolutionary act. George VI of the United Kingdom, the king who stuttered his way into history. Jump ahead a few centuries and we find a different kind of forgotten king, one who was quiet not from madness, but from humility. George VI wasn't supposed to be king. His brother, Edward VIII, had the job until he decided he'd rather marry an American divorcee. Scandalous at the time, now basically a Tuesday. So, in 1936, the shy, stammering younger brother suddenly found himself on the throne. He hated public speaking, he doubted himself constantly, and his own daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth II, later said she saw him cry from the pressure. But here's what made George VI remarkable. He stayed. During World War II, when London was being bombed nightly, he refused to leave the city. He walked through rubble, visited hospitals, and personally comforted survivors. The people adored him for it, not because he was heroic, but because he was human. He was gentle, awkward, brave in the quietest way possible. George VI died young, at 56, worn out from years of duty and chain-smoking. But his reign restored dignity to a monarchy on the brink of collapse. In a way, he was the opposite of all the others we've met tonight. A man who never wanted the crown, but carried it with quiet grace anyway. Let's close this royal sleepwalk with one final story, the loneliest of them all. Emperor Puyi of China, the last emperor who outlived his empire. Born in 1906, Puyi became Emperor of China at just 2 years old, the last of the Qing dynasty. His coronation was beautiful, elaborate, and completely meaningless. By 1912, the empire had collapsed, and little Puyi was formally abdicated. He was allowed to stay in the Forbidden City for a while. Servants still bowed, rituals continued, but it was all a shadow play. He was a child pretending to rule a vanished world. Eventually, the new government expelled him from the palace, and Puyi drifted through life like a ghost. At one point, he was installed as a puppet emperor by the Japanese during World War II, a title with no real power and even less dignity. When the war ended, Puyi was captured by the Soviets, handed over to Communist China, and sent to prison for re-education. There, for the first time, he learned to plant vegetables, to wash his own clothes, and to live like a normal human being. When he was finally released, Puyi worked as a humble gardener in Beijing. He'd sometimes visit the Forbidden City.
Part 4. The Tragic Queens and Doomed Dynasties. Hey there, still awake? Or maybe you're half asleep already, which honestly is the best state to be in for this final drift through royal melancholy. Tonight, we're closing the curtains on our journey with the women who wore crowns, often unwillingly, sometimes unwisely, and almost always unhappily. Because while kings could fumble and fail, queens had to endure. So settle in. Let's wander through palaces of silk and sorrow, where love was duty and power was a very quiet kind of prison. Queen Joanna of Castile, Juana de Loca, the queen who loved too much. Let's start with a woman unfairly known to history as the Mad Queen. Joanna of Castile was born in 1479, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain's power couple. From the start, she wasn't supposed to rule. She was just another royal daughter, destined for an arranged marriage. Her groom? Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. Now, let's pause right there, because yes, he was handsome, but he was also charming in the way that makes you double-check your wallet. Joanna, poor thing, fell deeply, catastrophically in love with him. He did not return the favor. When Philip cheated, which was often, Joanna lost her mind, and not in the poetic way. She screamed, sobbed, and locked herself in rooms. At one point, she physically attacked one of his mistresses, which, to be fair, was probably the most relatable thing any queen had done in centuries. But of course, her behavior gave everyone an excuse to call her mad. Convenient, isn't it? When Philip suddenly died in 1506, Joanna refused to let him go. Literally.
She traveled across Spain with his coffin for months, opening it periodically to make sure he was still there. Chronic grief? Definitely. But madness? Probably not. Her father used her instability as justification to lock her away for the rest of her life. She spent 46 years imprisoned in a convent, isolated from her children, her throne, and the world. History calls her Juana de Mad, but maybe she was just a woman who loved too fiercely in a world that only ever wanted her obedient. Let's float north to a queen whose greatest sin was being born in the wrong century and possibly wearing too many diamonds. Marie Antoinette, the queen who never said, "Let them eat cake." Ah, Marie Antoinette, the woman blamed for an entire revolution, and for a line she never actually said. Born in 1755, she was an Austrian archduchess who became Queen of France at just 14. She married Louis XVI, a gentle but awkward man who'd rather tinker with locks than rule a kingdom. The young queen was vivacious, stylish, and utterly clueless about how much the French people resented her. She spent lavishly on clothes, jewels, and hairstyles that could probably host a small ecosystem. But honestly, she wasn't doing anything that other royals hadn't done for centuries. She was just unlucky enough to do it while France was starving. By the time revolution came knocking, the public already saw her as the villain. Pamphlets painted her as a nymphomaniac and a witch. People whispered that she bathed in milk while peasants drank mud. When the mob finally stormed Versailles, Marie Antoinette faced them with eerie calm. She said, "Do not harm the children." And that was that. She was imprisoned, tried, and executed in 1793, beheaded by a device so efficient it was called the National Razor. Her last words, spoken to the executioner after she accidentally stepped on his foot, were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." Graceful, even at the end. Marie's story is tragic, but also strangely human. She didn't start wars or destroy empires. She just became the perfect symbol of everything that was already broken. Let's float east again to a queen who had power, too much of it, and lost it all in a single explosion of empire. Empress Alexandra of Russia, the queen who trusted the wrong mystic. Fast forward to the twilight of the Russian Empire. Alexandra Fyodorovna, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, married Tsar Nicholas II in 1894. She was shy, spiritual, and devoted to her family. She was also deeply unlucky. Her husband's rule coincided with the worst period in Russian history: revolution, war, and famine. And as if that wasn't enough, their only son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, a disease that made even a bruise life-threatening. Alexandra was desperate to save him, which is how a wandering Siberian monk named Rasputin slithered his way into the royal palace. Rasputin claimed he could heal the boy, and somehow, sometimes, he actually did, or at least seemed to. Whether through hypnosis, luck, or sheer force of personality, he gained the Empress's absolute trust. The rest of Russia, however, was horrified. Rasputin was vulgar, scandalous, and rumored to be sleeping with half the nobility. His influence over the royal family destroyed what little reputation they had left. When the revolution came in 1917, the royal family was arrested, and Alexandra was executed alongside her husband and children in a basement in Yekaterinburg. It's said she spent her last moments praying, still believing God would deliver them. The empire fell, the dynasty ended, and all that remained was the echo of a woman who just wanted her child to live. Let's cross the sea for one more queen, not of an empire, but of endurance itself. Queen Victoria, the widow who refused to move on. Now, we usually think of Queen Victoria as the iron matriarch of the 19th century, stoic, severe, maybe a little terrifying. But behind that image was a woman defined by grief. She became queen at 18, married her beloved Albert at 20, and spent 2 decades building a family that looked, for once, genuinely happy. And then Albert died. Typhoid, 1861. 42 years old. Victoria was inconsolable. She retreated from public life for years, wearing black every single day until her own death 4 decades later. Even her servants were forbidden from removing his toothbrush. She slept beside a plaster cast of his hand. She had his clothes laid out each morning as if he might walk back in. And she wrote in her journal every day to him as if he were still there. Her ministers begged her to reappear, but Victoria didn't care. She had ruled an empire, but she couldn't rule her own sorrow. Over time, the public forgave her. They saw her as the grieving mother of a grieving nation, a figure so heavy with loss that she almost became sacred. When she finally died in 1901, she was buried next to Albert, wearing his dressing gown and holding a lock of his hair. A love story, yes, but also a quiet tragedy. The tale of a queen who never stopped mourning, and maybe never wanted to. The final kingdom. So here we are, 4 queens, 4 very different dooms. One locked away for loving too much, one blamed for a nation's hunger, one destroyed by faith in a false prophet, and one consumed by a love that wouldn't die. Together, they remind us that royalty isn't really about power. It's about pressure, the unbearable weight of expectation pressed into a human heart. When we look back through time, the crowns glitter, the palaces gleam, the portraits stare proudly from their golden frames. But behind every polished face was someone lonely, frightened, or fragile. Someone who couldn't just take off the crown when it got too heavy. And maybe that's why we're still drawn to them. Not because they were perfect, but because they were heartbreakingly ordinary beneath all that ceremony. So as we close this long, sleepy descent through forgotten monarchs, from the mad to the melancholy, from kings who thought they were glass to queens who shattered quietly, take a breath. History isn't just about battles and empires, it's about people who tried, failed, and sometimes wept behind velvet curtains. And if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear them. The whispers of all those forgotten kings and queens echoing softly through the centuries. The crown slips, the candle fades, and another night in history finally goes dark.